reacting to a wild week 8 in the NFL. Shawn, week 7 had us feeling a little bit, this wasn't all that fun of a week to work our way through. Week 8 came roaring back in one of the more fun weeks, I think, of the entire fantasy football season. I was talking to you just before we kicked off. We had a lot of teams, scoring 20-plus points on both sides of matchups, and a lot of interesting scenarios to talk through, and because of those real-life NFL points being scored, a lot of fantasy points to work our way through as well. It was National Tight Ends Day, Shawn, on Sunday. I don't know if you were aware. They were referencing it quite heavily, but also was helped with the fact that the tight ends had quite a day on Sunday, putting up a lot of touchdowns, a lot of fantasy points. We'll be talking about them today as well on the podcast. But week 8, Shawn, how are you feeling as not quite the dust has settled? I know you were cramming before we started this, cramming in that Sunday night football game to allow us to talk about it on today's show. But I felt this week, no buys, lots of teams playing, but lots of points then being scored. And as I mentioned at the start, lots of things that we can talk through in today's show.
Yeah, this was a fun one. From a pure fantasy perspective and from a purely point of view fantasy perspective, it was tough because the quarterback play, specifically on some of my teams, some of our teams, Colm, this was the second week in a row to lose a star QB early, and there just aren't too many weeks where you can overcome that. Having Jordan Love go out in this one was pretty rough. Caleb Williams, somebody playing in a fill-in type of role, again, from a fantasy perspective, obviously he's the Chicago Bears starter. He looked extremely poor. So that part was disappointing. But you mentioned National Tight Ends week or day or what have you. The tight ends column were astonishing. In many cases, that trio of George Kittle, Trey McBride, and Brock Bowers has just almost single-handedly carried our teams into very good position. Trey McBride looked like maybe the best player in the league through the first half of games. And then on Sunday Night Football, George Kittle came through. He's like, no. So that part was a lot of fun. The other thing, though, now is that, Colm, you had suggested starting with fourth quarter Bo Nix for a whole game. Now, you get to play the Carolina Panthers. That is very different than, for example, the big headlining affair where Caleb Williams and Jayden Daniels playing each other, but more importantly, playing two defenses that at this point look very good. The Washington Commanders, really that upstart passing defense looks excellent. Even with that being the case, I mean, if you're Caleb Williams and you can't get the ball to DJ Moore, you can't get the ball to Keenan Allen, you can't get the ball to Roma Odunze, and you can't get the ball to Cole Kmet, that is a problem. By contrast, Bo Nix right now looks like the second best rookie quarterback after Jayden Daniels. Again, you have to adjust for the caliber of competition. This Carolina Panthers team is not good in any facet, but he put up a ton of points on Sunday. Looked good doing it. This week, the passes were on target, and the one pass that was merely aspirational, Adam Troutman is like, no, that's fine. I can make the best catch of the day. He did for a 37-yard touchdown.
One-handed.
The Denver Broncos look good.
And that was an awesome one-handed catch. And, there is times where, if we're looking at best ball or dynasty, heavily biased towards Bo Nix's success, rooting for it based on that aspect. But in terms of a rookie quarterback coming in, getting an opportunity and growing as the season has gone on, Nix, I think, has really been able to do that. The team are now 5-3. And you mentioned the fourth quarter Bo Nix kind of running joke. We kind of get it in the second quarter, Shawn. They put up 21 in the second quarter, none in the first quarter. But he finishes as 28 of 37 for 284 yards, 3 touchdowns. The one other thing that I want to point out, he also has the rushing touchdown or the sneak over the top. And obviously Sean Payton was with Drew Brees for many, many years, but we've seen him add that to his game in a couple of these contests, which is, a great way to be able to boost up your fantasy scoring. But Bo Nix, Shawn, in October. So we had a real struggle to start, and even in October there was struggles as well. But he's up now to 67% completion, 870 yards in October, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception, 149 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. And there's a lot of stuff like, just go back a week to Thursday Night Football. I couldn't go on social media without seeing this, pass that went between 2 players that could have been a wide open touchdown for both of those players. But now we're in a situation where, if you're watching the play, it is developing as we're moving forward. And then the other part is, like, fantasy wise, he is starting to deliver 29 points this particular week, but he's averaging 22 fantasy points, Shawn, per game since week 4. So he's getting into a tier where there's not many quarterbacks that are delivering and at that level. So I think there's still a lot of flaws to the game. There's a lot of things that need to be worked on. But if you look at a rookie, that's trying to develop in a situation, gets a really bad defense here. But we're looking at a situation where you mentioned Caleb Williams as well. He got a really bad defense and it did not go according to plan. So you have to, do it then when you're out there. Other parts of the game, we get Cortland Sutton. Shawn gets 100 receiving yards, 11 targets, 8 receptions for that 100 yards. Troutman, you mentioned 85 receiving yards and a touchdown on 4 receptions. But he is passing to a lot of a mixture here, I guess we'll say. It's a spread out offense. Little Jordan Humphreys in there quite a bit. Troy Franklin's not in there as much as we would like, Shawn.
Well, Colm, this is a 284-yard performance in a game where his college teammate, you kind of go back and you're wondering how he had such an astonishingly high completion percentage last year at Oregon, because Troy Franklin can't catch. The best pass of the day that Bo Nix threw was a bomb down the sideline to Troy Franklin. They just went right through his hands and barely touched either hand. And it was the most perfectly thrown ball all day. So
it reminds me, I think I mentioned this. I think I mentioned this in one of the recent shows as well. There's a lot of this particular offense that's reminding me of the Packers offense from last year, where in the first 6 weeks, it was why is every pass, 4 inches too far or 4 inches too short? And that felt like one of those passes where last year was going through Jordan Reed's hands. This year, then they'll make that particular play. So I'm hoping that they can start to click on that, but it's just always a little bit off between the two of them. But next,
it's not a little bit off. Troy Franklin just keeps dropping the passes.
That's also fair. When we look through Bryce Young, Shawn, on the other side, starting for the Panthers, he comes in with Andy Dalton now, 224 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. I think compared to what we've seen at the start of the season, there was a lot more positive in this than negative. And, when we talk about some of the kind of coach notes after it, I did see Sean Payton talk about being very frustrated with his defense giving up the yardage and giving up the 14 points that they did in this one. He called it a really bad offense that they were facing. But I have to say that Young did look a little bit better here, but the bar is very, very low from where he was starting off. Xavier Legette gets in the end zone for 34 and a touchdown on 7 targets. Jalen Coker gets in the end zone, 4 for 78 for him. But again, there's not a huge amount that he's working with. The interesting part here, I thought, was Chuba Hubbard leads the backfield, 15 of the 20 carries in this with just the 56 yards. But again, the Broncos, I think, are a tough matchup defensively from that perspective. Somebody who we thought was starting to step forward, Shawn, and Jatavion Sanders. He just has the 1 target for 1 reception, 7 yards in this one. So, we'll see if that's a Bryce Young thing or an Andy Dalton thing. But how did you feel about the Panthers side of things? Is there anything to note here? And then on the Broncos, any other things that you want to highlight? Williams led the backfield with the 17 carries with just the 44 yards. Not a lot of production from the running backs here. It did have a nice receiving touchdown, I will say, for Jaleel McLaughlin from Bo Nix.
Yeah, McLaughlin probably needs to play more. Javonte Williams, sadly, was back to looking like Ezekiel Elliott. I think on Young's side, he did some solid things in this game. There still are significant questions about his ability to either A, get the ball down the field, or B, get the ball out. It was a pretty stark contrast, especially when you consider the criticism that Bo Nix has taken for checking down, that he was able to attack down the field, and his decisiveness is elite, whereas you don't see any of that with Bryce Young. And yet the passes that he did throw seemed just more like NFL passes today than what we've gotten to this point in his NFL career, where everything about his ability to play the position, arm strength, accuracy, certainly decision-making, was very weak. I do think that one of the things that helped is that Jalen Coker is out there. And anybody who has been listening to any of Blair's shows, reading his content, knows that Blair has been a Jalen Coker super fan since early in the draft process. That may sound weird to some people, as he obviously was not a high-profile player. And yet you look at Coker out there, there's no question that he's better than Jonathan Mingo. He's also better than Xavier Legette. That gives them another very mild weapon. And certainly in this type of offense, that's what you're looking for, especially when Deontay Johnson isn't in there. Deontay Johnson, Jatavian Sanders, possibly guys that Andy Dalton is able to take advantage of a little bit better. You do see quarterback changes be much more favorable for one player than the other. Hopefully, as they kind of move forward here, we'll get some Deontay Johnson. We'll get some Andy Dalton. Although, the thing I would say from the Panthers' perspective is there's really no reason for Andy Dalton to play anymore this season. You need to make absolutely sure that Bryce Young isn't going to turn a corner. I mean, you're going to lose almost all the rest of your games anyway. You'd like to build a little bit of momentum going into 2025. They're just not talented enough to do that.
So we'll move on to the game you were cramming in before we started to record today's show. The San Francisco 49ers get a win against the Dallas Cowboys. The 49ers 4-4 now. Positive reports coming out that, expectations week 10, we may see CMC back in the mix here. We do get Jordan Mason in for part of this game, is on the sidelines. Again, we've seen that in a couple of weeks now where he's not necessarily ruled out, but is not available. That led to Isaac Guerrero coming in and getting a larger opportunity than he has so far. He has 14 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown. We also get a long rush in this one from Ricky Pearsall, who goes for 39 yards on his one carry, and he gets 4 targets for 4 receptions, 38 yards in this one. Positive to see Guerrero also using the passing game, 4 targets, 4 receptions for 17. Which on the talking point here, I guess, has to be a little bit that Deebo Samuel has recovered enough that he was in on this, and then he does get banged up on this. We'll see what the reports are as the week goes on. But he has 7 targets, 4 receptions for 71. George Kittle, Shawn, though, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 128 and 1. One of those he almost gets into the end zone. He stopped just around the 3-yard line on his 43-yard run. But man, I don't think I would want to be tasked with trying to stop him once he is moving. The 49ers obviously get the win. They are limited with what is there on offense, but the players that they still have are very talented. And then you see some of the young players like a Pearsall, like a Guerrero being able to step up in this situation. The Cowboys have not been able to stop the run, over the entire season. Basically, we get Brock Purdy with 56 rushing yards in this one, 16 being the long, but that's on 8 carries. Ezekiel Elliott, Shawn, gets in the end zone for the Cowboys. You made a comment already. We know that Ezekiel Elliott is done at this particular point. Dalvin Cook was out there, 6 carries for him, 10 carries for Elliott. Cook also being outshone kind of by Elliott. So that's not a positive sign for his outlook, I guess. But the positives here for the Cowboys, Shawn, CeeDee Lamb is incredible. We know that. We want him to get double-digit targets every game. He gets 17 targets in this. The next closest is Jake Ferguson with 8. Lamb has 13 receptions, 146 yards, 2 touchdowns, maybe 2 of the most wide-open touchdowns that he's ever going to score. He gets them back-to-back in one game here. But Lamb finishes with a 46% target share in this game, and it is a situation for the Cowboys. I mentioned Elliott and I mentioned Cook. The Cowboys are the only remaining team, Shawn, in the league now without a running play of 20 or more yards this season. And then I did see Rich Rebar just before we started recording tweeted out that the Cowboys have now trailed by double digits for 39.5% of their offensive snaps. The only team worse than that is the Panthers at 51.3. So you're in a situation where obviously the defense is not getting helped by their offensive state in terms of being down by double digits, but that is going to help the likes of a CeeDee Lamb. But the offense here for the Cowboys at the moment feels like if you are starting them in fantasy, it really has to be CeeDee Lamb and not much else. Like if we look at Dak Prescott, even 243 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Fine fantasy day, but it feels like this is all on CeeDee Lamb moving forward if you're looking for what to do with Dallas fantasy wise.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a fine fantasy day, as you mentioned, for Dak Prescott. Anybody starting Jordan Love would have loved those numbers. This is what you are expecting to get from CeeDee Lamb, especially given the Cowboys' overall context, where they made an odd decision in the offseason to not build out the rest of their offense, which was the opposite of what most of the contenders did. Even contenders who failed with it because of injuries, like the Kansas City Chiefs, for example, they were making that effort. 17 targets for Lamb. I wouldn't say that's not enough, because there's a limit to how much beating your receiver can reasonably take. But this is more the direction we would want to see. When you look at rest of season, you expect CeeDee Lamb to be the number one receiver and probably the number one flex eligible player, right? We think about where the various running backs are. Not a great day for Saquon Barkley, certainly a disappointing day for Breece Hall. You think about where the receivers are, and you and I had some difficult choices in terms of, do we put Jordan Addison in when at this point, everything is going to Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson on Thursday night played one of the greatest receiver games of all time, and playing one of the greatest receiver games of all time just gets him up to being a viable first-round pick. Now, that kind of level of performance is certainly what you're hoping out of a first-round pick, because you can easily select players at that price who either because of injury or because of context are not able to come through. But Sam Darnold is a weak enough QB that they've done a fantastic job of managing him to solid fantasy performances, managing the offense to solid reality performances, getting Justin Jefferson, more or less where he needs to be. But you think about the level that Jefferson is playing at to merely be good, and you certainly wouldn't expect him to be able to keep up with Lamb or Tyreek Hill now that Tua is back, Jamar Chase, those guys. And out of all of that, the guy who stands out, who's most likely to have more of these 15 to 20 target games, is CeeDee Lamb. They have nothing else. At one point, they mentioned that Elliott had his first 10-yard carry of the season in this one. Going into week 7, so a week ago, he and Joe Mixon were the only two players that SIS had not charted with an evaded tackle. Now, in week 7, which again was a week ago, Joe Mixon had a huge number of those. So Mixon no longer remotely in that category, but that gives you a little bit of a feel. It certainly sounded like the plan for the Cowboys in this game was to go with Rico Dowdle and Dalvin Cook, with Elliott maybe mixing in to do a little pass blocking, that type of thing. But once Dowdle was ill, that wasn't really possible. Dalvin Cook didn't look good again. I don't know that anybody is going to look that good in this offense because they don't run block, and the team is collapsing, right? Their defense, absolutely atrocious. On the 49ers side, it was exciting because Isaac Guerendo looked good. And again, you kind of hinted about the fact that we have a decent amount of, and again, it's, round 19, round 20 of Guerendo in best ball. I would in no way, shape, or form look at this game and say, oh, Guerendo is better than Jordan Mason. They're two very different backs. Guerendo doesn't run nearly as hard, isn't going to break nearly as many tackles, but frankly, almost no one is, right? There are only 3 or 4 backs in football that are similar to Jordan Mason in terms of how hard they hit the hole, how many guys they can shake off, how many yards he can get with the leg churn after he has multiple guys hanging on him.
But that might be why he's also always banged up as well.
Well, it's going to be tough. Injuries just constantly are infuriating in fantasy. You can imagine what it's like for the players themselves. You can imagine what it's like for the reality coach and GM and teammates, where these are their friends and the people who are going to determine whether or not they succeed in what they've worked, every waking minute on during the week. I do think that this game was incredibly encouraging for the 49ers from the perspective of Guerendo is a speed back. And prior to this game, when he'd had opportunities, he didn't look comfortable. He didn't look like that prototypical 49ers back where you're getting him into space. He's making the one cut. He's exploding up the field. And when there are opportunities, you're getting the blocked yardage and then potentially plus. In this game, the speed was so evident. The vision, which I think is something going back to college, when you look at him being one of the most athletic running backs to ever come through the combine. You look at his college numbers. One of the things I was trying to remind people is his college numbers weren't as bad as people think. They were just nowhere near the level of what you could imagine for someone with his style of athleticism. I thought the 49ers were the perfect landing spot. You could see it in this game. He looked really good. And I think that a future where they have a moderately healthy Christian McCaffrey, who obviously is the starter and then is doing a lot in the passing game, and then one where you could theoretically mix Mason and Guerendo to give those different styles to the opposing defense. I think the run game in the San Francisco is going to be very tough to stop when they come back out of their bye. The other element was that Debo looked fantastic, as you mentioned. George Kittle, it was so obvious again today, and this isn't necessarily the reason that we drafted these guys, but it does play in when you think about Trey McBride and his mobility, the hurdle that he had, and that when you think about Brock Bowers and even a game where you've got Gardner Minshew sort of rarely looking in his direction, you have the Chiefs in many cases double and triple teaming him. He just looks like a completely different, almost species, but certainly a completely different type of tight end. And then you have Kittle with the ball in his hands in this game. Those three players are so separated from the rest of the NFL at the tight end position, both before and after the catch. It was a huge game for him in a game where they needed him to step up because of the different injuries. But the other really cool storyline here is that Ricky Pearsall looked good. I mean, he didn't have some amazing game, the 4 for 38 as a receiver, and we're going to mostly evaluate him as a receiver. We wouldn't necessarily expect him to have a lot of those 40-yard carries, basically. Although, again, with how much Debo is banged up, if you think that Pearsall's athleticism is that level and that he's only okay as a receiver, then you have a lot of incentive to get in the ball in other ways. So maybe some of that will continue. But even though 4 for 38 isn't that big of a deal within the context of where he is as being a pretty overdrafted prospect and then going through all of that adversity, coming back here, the smoothness, the athleticism, the fact that it was him and not, a Chris Conley, a Ronnie Bell, a Cowing, any of those types of guys, I think that that's very exciting, both for the 49ers and for his dynasty value when we think about where these guys are going to be in a month.
Yeah, I thought he looked good for the opportunities he had. And you have to remember as well, like, we're looking at player health, but this is a guy who got shot a couple of months ago, in terms of, I'm sure he's working his way back to full health, full fitness as well. And that's another, again, to always go back a couple of times a season, Shawn, to remind you just how wild these NFL players are. Like, we had Deebo Samuel, who obviously went out for part of this game, but, following last Sunday's game, whatever amount of form of it, had, symptoms of pneumonia. And then a week later, he's out there playing. These guys are, I don't know how to compare it to normal humans. You mentioned different species, but there's a certain mindset for these guys to be out there playing in these situations when you look around all teams around the NFL every single week. So Debo did step up in this one. We are going to bounce over, Shawn, to the Atlanta Falcons, another game where we had a lot of tight end points with Tampa Bay also. So you mentioned what happened with George Kittle. Shawn, Cade Otton, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 81 yards, 2 touchdowns going his way. We had Kyle Pitts, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 91, and 2 touchdowns going his way. Otton, obviously, with all the injuries that have happened to the Buccaneers, but since Mayfield has been in this offense, he has consistently got a little bit more work over and over and over again. And, Mayfield obviously trusts him there, but a very, very productive day for him in a situation where they were working from behind the majority of this one. Darnell Mooney has 7 targets, 5 receptions, 91, and a touchdown. We get a receiving touchdown for Bijan Robinson. He has 6 targets, 6 receptions, 37 yards. Also has the 63 yards on the ground. Kirk Cousins, Shawn, continues to pick things up. His injury, obviously, the first couple of weeks wasn't moving around as well. There's times where he's not moving around as well. Yeah, but 29 pass attempts, 23 completions, 276, 4 touchdowns for him. I think this Falcons offense is starting to really find another gear and look pretty fun doing it. It's very, very condensed when you look at the targets around the offense. Charlie Warner got 1 target, but taking him out of it, there's only 5 other people receiving targets, in Mooney, Pitts, Robinson, Drake London, and Ray McLeod. A quieter day here for Drake London. Overall, 4 for 34 for him. Mayfield does have 3 passing touchdowns again, 2 interceptions, 330 yards on 50 pass attempts. The running backs all split up, Shawn, between Irvin, White, and Sean Tucker. Sean Tucker just getting the 2 carries in this one. White getting 6 targets, 5 receptions, 38, and a touchdown in the passing game. 7 targets for Bucky Irvin for 7 for 40, just the 1 target for Tucker for 12 yards. Jalen McMillan gets 7 targets in the absence of all the other star players that are now missing in Evans and Godwin, but he just has the 4 for 35. Nobody else really stepped up outside of the wide receivers and Cade Otton, offensively to a big perspective that we'll be looking at for fantasy moving forward. Maybe you'll have a name to sprinkle in there. But the one thing I really want to highlight, Shawn, for people who didn't watch this, you look at the box score, it looks good. What won't be in the box score, firstly, is this Buccaneers callback uni or throwback uni. Is this the worst uni that you have ever seen? I don't even know what color it is. It's like a faded orange.
I love those uniforms. That's
an abomination, Shawn.
When I was a little kid, right, and you go to the library and you check out the books on like all 32 NFL teams, and you read through the history of the franchise, and that Tampa Bay one with those, that's what the Buccaneers are supposed to look like. This current one where it's some like RoboCop /
the current one isn't great, but the old one is not. It's not like my eyes are not like wanting.
It's not hyper masculine. It's awfully cool. It seemed like they should have won this game purely because of the uniforms and because Baker Mayfield throws 50 passes. Colm. Baker Mayfield swiftly becoming my favorite NFL quarterback. No one
has anyone said that
no
before?
One plays with less conscience than Baker Mayfield, which you absolutely love. They move the ball.
Maybe Brett Favre reincarnated here. Like this is
you get a really small version of Brett Favre without the arm talent, but with even more moxie, I think. Yeah. Right? I mean, you've got Baker Mayfield throwing these balls. They move all the way down the field. He throws a red zone pick. He throws an end zone pick. He's kind of looking at the throw like, if I had it to take back, would I take it back? No. So, we're going to get more of those passes. The frustrating thing for him, I think, has to be that the receivers, like you mentioned, didn't really show up. Jalen McMillan, Trey Palmer, Sterling Shepard, all very trendy waiver wire pickups last week. They weren't going for massive dollars, but certainly when you consider who those guys are, they went for a pretty decent amount. In this game, you got 14 targets to them, and you don't get 100 yards. So from that perspective, I kept waiting for the Falcons, and they did finally adjust to it a little bit. But with the receivers doing so little, I was like, maybe you want to roll some coverage to Cade Otton. Maybe you want to have someone pick him up off the line. He looked good. Now, it's a huge step down. One of the things that was kind of funny about this, when you think about the star tight ends, and then you think about the other guys who will occasionally fall into volume, Otton looked decent. He did look like a guy who, when you have other players like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, you're mostly trying to throw the ball to them. Kyle Pitts, happy for the scores.
The other thing before, when I said about the unis, Shawn, the one thing I was going to highlight before I remembered about the unis was Kyle Pitts' second touchdown does not show up in the box score as almost one of the most boneheaded plays of the season. When when we're talking about those plays where they do not have the kind of pylon cam or the line down, when we're looking to see if a running back has made it in and they go with the call on the field. I'm still not convinced that Kyle Pitts had broken the plane on that particular play, but he decided to celebrate anyway. Gets knocked out, and it's not great.
Yeah, he didn't get in, but they had to stay with it. Didn't have an angle on it.
Yeah, it was obviously we want them to get in, but as an NFL franchise, or the NFL in general, player at the pylon, any reason that we don't have an angle at that particular point of the field to see if he's in or not? Might be.
Maybe they've looked at your European football, and you have claimed to me that they are having more trouble than it's worth trying to make a lot of those replays.
So less
work.
Replays. Less angles, less replays. Okay.
Like less controversy when
sweep it under the carpet.
right, exactly. Sweep it under the carpet. The contrast of Kyle Pitts evidently having no idea that guy was there versus the play in the Commanders game where Jayden Daniels is rolling out and a Chicago Bears defender dives at his legs, and completely blind, Daniels leaps, pulls his legs up, avoids the tackle. One player right now is among the best players in football. The other one, if he weren't a top 5 pick, probably would have been benched. It was exciting to see Kyle Pitts involved in this game. This was a little bit more what I would expect to get from the Falcons, which is it's going to be tough. Now, fantasy managers have gotten a lot of points from Drake London. I'm sure that they don't regret selecting him at all. They'll get more points going forward. He hasn't really demonstrated the ability to consistently separate or run without the football that would make you think that if a team wanted to take him away, that would be an impossible task. Now, in this case, the big takeaway for the Falcons is probably if you take him away, we get these easy touchdowns to Kyle Pitts where he's mostly not covered. You get these plays to Darnell Mooney. I guess my point is basically I expect Mooney and London to be very volatile, especially when you're looking at Kirk Cousins looking good and yet still not quite looking like himself, not being the peak version. And the peak version, again, is someone who needs to be managed into relatively positive situations, play in domes, that kind of thing, to be effective. The other element here, and it wasn't that egregious in this game, but they don't run as many plays as the Bucs. Part of the 50 touchdown passes for Baker Mayfield is they do get up to 72 total plays. Robinson and Algier combined for 25 carries. I think we would prefer to see that skewed a little bit more in the favor of Robinson, but he does also have the 6 receptions. Not a huge game for him from a yardage perspective. But Bijan Robinson in this game did a little better job, again, kind of getting upfield. There was yet another play where he made some incredible lateral moves and broke tackles or evaded tackles that would not seem possible for a big back. And then when it was time to put his foot in the ground and get north-south, that's the gear he doesn't quite have. Now, that comment is based on him being a top 5 pick and coming in as a supposed generational prospect. It's not compared to the average NFL back, which he's still well above. So that's kind of where we are with Robinson and how we would love to see him take the next step. He may not have that.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned a lower yardage day, but he still did hit 100 yards from scrimmage in total. Had the 6 receptions and the touchdown. But there is stuff that he can do that kind of nobody else can do. But there's also the stuff that some of those other elite backs do that he just doesn't do. Mainly, as you mentioned, that kind of breakaway speed towards the end. But Cade Otton, Shawn, that's back-to-back games, and obviously we've had the injuries. Obviously, the Godwin injury was very, very late in that particular contest, but Evans went out early in the last one. He scored 18 and now 29.1 points in those last 2 games PPR wise. So that's 2 of his top 3 outings of his career from a fantasy perspective, and it will be interesting to track that moving forward. There'll be some. I had to. I have him on some rosters that I didn't start him this week, but there will be some spot starts in some of those dynasty rosters. Maybe you could sneak him in. But again, like you mentioned with some of the Falcons, that it will be volatile. I could see it being volatile for him, but I also think that the target competition, particularly the way it played out this week, that he may become a point of emphasis on the offense and may just get there on volume.
Important to note that it's 10 out of 50. And yet, I do think that he's got a very nice floor for fantasy managers at this point. There's a great rapport between Mayfield and Otton, and he's out there all the time. He's the safety valve. He's going to be that guy who bails out a ton of managers who either missed on their early selection or decided to wait. I think he could be a very high leverage player as we come down the stretch in fantasy football.
We're going to move over, Shawn, now to the Commanders game. You were mentioning the Bears and that game and how Jayden Daniels avoided that particular tackle attempt, but I thought you were going in a different direction, and it was obviously a crazy ending as the Commanders went 18-15. They are now 6-2 on the season, 4-0 at home. From where the Commanders have been, or maybe even their expectations are this year, a great story to kickstart the season for them in their division and heading towards the playoff. Jayden Daniels was shown 326 total yards in the air with 1 touchdown, 21 of 38. So, still things that could be improved on there overall, but he has 52 yards on the ground on 8 carries. Shawn, Hail Mary at the end that goes to Noah Brown. I thought that's where you were going, as videos have circulated on social media of one of the defensive backs kind of, talking trash to the Commanders fans as the play is off. The play, you can see the Hail Mary in action, and then unfortunately for him, it is Tyreek Stevenson who goes in and knocks the ball that eventually goes to Noah Brown. So, some concerns there. I did see he did tweet to hold his hands up and say it was something that he has to learn from, but that is kind of unacceptable, I'm sure, for Bears fans out there. They're 4-3 on the season. Jayden Daniels, Shawn, comes into this one, was questionable, does play, gets hit early on a relatively normal tackle, and they were working on him again at the sideline. I was concerned that, as you mentioned, those players who missed out on time this week, and we haven't mentioned Drake May yet. He was another one that went out. I was concerned that Daniels may have been following suit there. Brian Robinson, 16 carries, leads the backfield here, 65 yards for him. Austin Eckler, 7 for 52 on the ground. Terry McLaurin has a nice day, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 125 for him. We get 11 targets for Zach Ertz, who led the team, which, again, not optimal. I don't think 7 for 77 for him. He did quite well out of those targets overall. Obviously, Noah Brown's numbers spiked dramatically with that last reception, 3 for 73 and a touchdown for him. This was a game, Shawn, where, as you mentioned earlier, the Bears looked really, really bad, and it looked like they were almost going to win this one. They have no points in the first half. The problem for the Commanders is they're going down the field. They're settling for field goals, and they did have 1 missed field goal during the contest. But what happens overall is we get a kind of a DeAndre Swift rush around the side that goes for 56 yards and a touchdown on a little bit of a broken scenario, it felt like, where I didn't think when he got that ball, he was getting to the end zone, but he has 129 yards and 18 carries. Williams has 41 yards on 10 carries for him, but 10 of 24, 131 through the air. Offense does not look good, looks broken. We get 6 targets to Dunze for 3 receptions. We get 7 to Keenan Allen for 2 receptions, 4 to DJ Moore for 2. We just get the 1 target to Cole Kmet for 14 yards. The Bears looked absolutely dreadful in this, and we've touched on it a number of times in terms of some of the poor defensive matchups in the league. And obviously the Commanders are starting to pick up some wins, but they showed serious frailties early in the season. Maybe they are getting some things back together, but this Bears team, there's a lot to be concerned. As much as there is to be optimistic about Jayden Daniels, there's a lot to be concerned about here for this Bears team moving forward.
It was interesting this week to go through Blair's wrong read and see just how much the Commanders had moved up defensively, especially as a passing defense. Now, a little bit of that is getting to play the Carolina Panthers last week, but they look tough again in this one. And or Caleb Williams. This game was so bad that it goes from thinking he could be an absolute star to wondering like how much Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson there is, not in his game specifically. All three of those players are very different stylistically, but in terms of being more hype than substance, it's tough. Now, Caleb Williams obviously much better for much longer than any of those other two players in college. But I just don't know how you can play an entire game like this with those four weapons and have, 10 for 24. This was a game where you saw that Hail Mary go up and you're thinking this might happen because the football gods are not going to let the Chicago Bears win this game. They played excruciatingly poorly. The Chicago Bears have no business being anywhere in the mix to be a playoff team. This was a game where I think you have to fire your offensive staff this week, because if you don't, you have a really good chance of coming out of this season with your two top 10 picks already, borderline ruined. Rome Odunze is so far down the list of wide receivers at this point. I guess I still wasn't that impressed with the Ladd McConkey game. And yet, what he's doing is far beyond Odunze. We had another impressive performance from Keon Coleman. Obviously, guys like Brian Thomas had already gone well beyond Odunze. We've always had Xavier Worthy ranked ahead of Odunze. And even though he had a weird, somewhat frustrating game, the Chiefs were able to get him sort of a manufactured touchdown at the end. Not manufactured, but just very clearly after he had struggled on the previous play, they drew up a touchdown for him. The Chiefs executed it. The Bears don't have the ability to drop like any play ever. The DeAndre Swift touchdown, the space opened up. We've been a little bit critical of Swift. He was frustrating last year with the Eagles, but that play is almost entirely on Swift and his combination of vision, burst, athleticism to finish it. We've watched, partly it's just that the other team is continuing to try. So when a guy goes, for 50, 60 yards and gets pulled down inside the 10-yard line, it's not actually on them. The defense is also there. And we got some great examples again this week of how important it is for people to keep playing. Khalif Raymond had a return touchdown for the Lions, but would have had a second one if a defender who was way out of the play hadn't fought all the way back through to make a tackle. Swift is able to finish off his play, and most of that was on him. And if you don't get that, then this is one of the most embarrassing performances in which a team could have beaten a somewhat solid opponent on the road of all time. It's just every single play watching Caleb Williams. One of the reasons that he ran 10 times for 41 yards in this game was that he couldn't find anybody open. He was 10 for 24 and ran 10 times. You're talking about passing plays that as passing plays were successful about 10 out of 34. It was mind-boggling how bad they were. I don't think that the Bears yet would go back and do it over, but Drake May looks a lot better. Bo Nix looks a lot better. But the guys who didn't play, J.J. McCarthy and Michael Penix, move way up compared to Caleb Williams just because they were on the sidelines this week. It's impossible. And this just goes back to early in the season, again, where they've looked awful almost all of the time. You just got to make better hiring decisions. This was brutally obvious coming off of what Shane Waldron did last year with the Seahawks. But I think that Jayden Daniels would overcome it. The gap between Jayden Daniels and Caleb Williams right now, this is very similar to last season, where the number one pick looks bad. The number two pick looks like a generational type of guy. Now, that kind of thing can switch. CJ Stroud has looked very human this year. I don't know. Am I overstating this? Some of it is frustration with having played Caleb Williams in a few places yesterday, but I thought that this performance was absolutely astonishing because the things that we had seen, even as they struggled up to this point, were that sense of calm, that sense of almost majesty of like, I am a star. I'm going to be able to handle this. And my arm talent, in addition to my ability as someone who can keep the play alive. I mean, Caleb Williams can extend plays and give his guys a chance to run around. And then he has the arm talent to make any throw. And yet, even with all of that in place, I think 10 for 24 with 10 scrambles.
This game at points, it became almost unwatchable as to how poor the Bears were playing on offense. I think, give a rookie quarterback the time. It's going to be up and down. There's going to be some things, but there is the path that it can go to, continue to go on the downslope. Now, I don't think we're into the Bryce Young territory yet, but there's a clear difference between the two quarterbacks that played in this game. And I think part of it is there's a clear difference in how the offensive coordinators and the organization trust them to, try and run the offense. Like we talked about Bo Nix earlier, and for all Bo Nix's flaws, the one thing I do think is Sean Payton thinks that, like, go and try it. Like, if you don't succeed, that's okay, but like, we're going to give you a chance to do it. Whereas I think the Bears are sometimes playing, football that's going to limit them moving forward. But if we look through, his start to the season, again, he's a rookie. There's going to be things, but there's quite a few games where like the completion percentage is quite dreadful. And some of the games then that we thought that maybe they were back on track, like, they put up a lot of points against the Carolina Panthers. Like, everyone's putting up a lot of points against the Carolina Panthers, put up the points against the Jags. Now the Packers got out of jail against the Jaguars this week, but still put up 30 points on them. I think that we're looking at, it's going to be up and down, but I think that they're going to struggle for large portions of the rest of the season, and it's going to be quite tricky to start your DJ Moores, to start your Keenan Allens. Sometimes you may not have a better option than that, or to start a Dunze, but there's a lot to be concerned about with those particular players moving forward. I did mention the Packers, Shawn. Jordan Love did go out early in this one, but relatively early, but not like he had thrown 22 passes at that point. He hadn't looked particularly great, all things considered. Did have one interception before he went out, 14 of 22 for 196 yards in this particular game. Trevor Lawrence has 308 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. They surge back towards the end. The Packers then get enough time on the clock to go and get a winning field goal. And, the Packers have had their field goal issues all season up until the last couple of weeks when they made the change. I couldn't watch PATs at the start of the season as a Packers fan without thinking they were going to mess with Brant McManus 3 for 3 here. So give him a shout out with the winning kick in 2 back-to-back weeks. The Packers leaving it a lot closer than I would like to see. But Shawn, this was a game where I mentioned Jordan Love didn't play great, which leads to some of the passing numbers or the receiving numbers then not being all that extravagant. We get 6 targets to Christian Watson, 4 for 39. We get 3 targets just to Jayden Reed, one of those coming on a 51-yard play that ended up setting up that field goal. So before that, he was 1 for 4 in terms of receptions, 1 for 4 yards, that is. He finishes 2 for 55. That was from Malik Willis. Dobbs has 6 targets, obviously since his week where he missed. The kind of squeaky wheel is getting the opportunities. He goes 3 for 72. Tucker Kraft, though, Shawn, has a very easy walk-in touchdown in this one from Malik Willis. He has 3 targets, 3 receptions, 78, and 1 touchdown. So not as much volume coming the way of Kraft, but still getting enough production as we move through this. I have to say, Malik Willis does deserve a shout out, not for being like a great fantasy player or anything like that, but he has played 3 games now for the Packers, Shawn, this season. They've won all 3. And, when you're looking at backup quarterbacks coming in situations, the job that he has done, although he only throws 5 passes, completes 4 of them for 56 and 1. And I mentioned, that pass that went to Jayden Reed for 51 yards. Well, he only had the 5 passing yards prior to that particular one. But getting the team a win on the road, I think, is pretty big to step in. Looking, though, at the Jaguars, the difficult news coming out of this is Christian Kirk broke his collarbone in this one. He's out for the season, did have 5 receptions, 2 for 59. Brian Thomas, he had a receiving touchdown on a quieter game for him, but 4 targets, 3 receptions, 60 yards, and a touchdown. He has had a tremendous start to the season, but he is having an MRI over the course of the opening part of this week on his ribs. So hopefully that won't be a long-term thing for him. Gabe Davis also got banged up in this one. Evan Ingram gets a really strong kind of triple coverage touchdown towards the end of this. He has 5 targets, 4 receptions, 36 and a touchdown. But outside of that, Shawn, that was kind of the offense here, with Tank Bigsby leading the way for the running backs. 18 carries for 78 yards for him. Looking at this game in general, the unfortunate part for the Jaguars is, the injury-related news. Now, if Christian Kirk's out for the season and Brian Thomas is, maybe he misses 1 week, 2 weeks, and then he's back. Like, the uptick in his usage should be very, very strong remaining the rest of the season. He's looked brilliant as a rookie, and if he comes into additional volume, that could be a positive for him. On the Packers side of things, with Love going out and Love not playing well, particularly before that, I think that kind of makes this game a little bit trickier to judge for the Packers. Like, once we get a situation where Willis is in there, the passing game almost becomes null and void. I did mention it, Shawn, last week on the show, and I know it was, I said it kind of tongue in cheek, but Josh Jacobs, 25 carries, 127 yards, 2 touchdowns. Not the most exciting player in the world, but he is getting the job done here. What were your thoughts on this contest?
Yeah, Josh Jacobs is
an NFL player. Maybe not NFL caliber, but he does play in the NFL. And he scored 2 touchdowns and 127
yards. For whatever reason you didn't want Aaron Jones, who's electric, Josh Jacobs is someone who can carry the ball 25 times.
Yeah.
This game was pretty disappointing because we're obviously not rooting in that direction. He looks always like just a guy. The spread element of the Packers receiving group, especially when you have a lower volume situation like this. Now, you talked about Jordan Love not playing that great. He averages almost 9 yards per attempt despite dealing with that injury. I thought that he looked fine. The person who is the absolute standout here and is becoming the best player on this offense is Tucker Kraft. He probably can't get to that level that we talked about with the 3 superstars because he's not that level of athlete. And yet his combination of the ability to catch, he's got absolutely fantastic hands. And then some of the things that he does after the catch, both having that sort of instinctive body control for a big player that allows him to exploit small angles, do little things like that. And then you combine the intensity, the ferociousness. I mean, he and Trey McBride run more enthusiastically than most players once they catch the ball.
I think when they get the ball, they look like, if you had like horses and they're like, they're not caged up, but they're in a fenced enclosure for a while, and you're like, yeah, open the gate and off. You just run wherever you want, and they're just like bolting over. Like, that's what they look like when they're out there. The other part that I didn't mention, he did have a reception that's 67 yards, a kind of a scramble by Jordan Love who goes deep, and Kraft is the one who receives that one. So that was obviously a big play as well from Tucker Kraft outside of the touchdown.
So he looks good. It's just, when you get Malik Willis in and essentially the game completely shuts down, that part is frustrating. I had mentioned Caleb Williams in relation to Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson. I don't actually think he's going to go remotely that path. I think Trevor Lawrence is probably the better parallel, where Lawrence needed the coaching change after his first season. The coaching change made a big difference. He suddenly looks much more like a starting caliber quarterback, but that's all he is, right? There's not that additional level in this game. Again, you see all of these types of plays where the ball is either out too early or inaccurately. The upside with Lawrence is he does make decisions fast, and he's got the big arm. You're going to have a hard time sacking him. He can threaten you deep. When you have that combination, then your team's going to be in it. And you saw the deep targets to Brian Thomas. I think that if you are a Jaguars fan, it's also frustrating that you had 5 different receivers with 4 or more targets in this game. You'd love to have it a little bit more concentrated. That's coming with the injuries that you articulated there. Evan Ingram not very involved in this game until the end when he does get the touchdown. The Jaguars do fight back, and I mean, this would have been a devastating loss for your Green Bay Packers because the Jaguars are a team that, again, just needs to do a full reboot. But you do like to see the competitiveness. You do like to see Tank Bigsby fighting for the yards that are there for him. At home with Malik Willis leading the Packers, it did feel like you were going to get that Jaguars comeback. They probably should have gotten it, but Jayden Reed makes the big play at the end. He was visibly frustrated throughout this game. We'll see where he is health-wise. We'll see where Jordan Love is health-wise. Right now, we're kind of dealing with a scenario where it seems like a player who is among the most electric in the NFL is probably not going to do what we hoped based on context. Colm, a week from now, maybe we'll be saying the opposite. Hopefully all of these guys can be healthy and Jordan Love comes roaring back. Any early news on kind of where he is?
No, it seems like it's just going to be a kind of a day-to-day thing. The reports so far on Monday were very confident that he's back in 100%. The Packers have a week 10 bye, but obviously there's games to come up this week as well. So I think that ideally, Shawn, because you're mentioning Jayden Reed electric plays, Packers versus the Lions in week 9. We want Jordan Love out there for that. We want to see, and that's not just me as a Green Bay
I've got some
Packers
bad
fan.
news for you, Colin. That is going to be a blowout Lions victory regardless. The Lions are easily the best team in football right now.
Yeah, we're going to get to them on the second show of the week, so maybe we'll think ahead to that as well. But yeah, maybe it's in Green Bay. I don't think the Packers are going to write it off as one, but maybe both teams will just run the ball 85 times each, and we'll see who is the winner at the end of it. But that is going to do it for it.
If they're going to do that, the winner is going to be the team that has Jahmyr Gibbs, not the team that has Josh Jacobs. Fair enough.
We will leave it there, though. This has been the RotoViz Overtime Monday recap episode. Hopefully you're enjoying the shows as they come out. It's always great hearing from the RotoViz OT community. We appreciate each and one of you listening in, and we have the interactions throughout the off season. It's always good to have it running through the season as well. But we are going to be back with our Wednesday edition. Who knows, as I mentioned last week, if you're subscribed, maybe you even get that on Tuesday when we tend to record those particular shows. You might get a little bit earlier if you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Until we are back, have a good one.